little chat around accessibility versus inclusion. I think quite often we can get those two sort of swapped over. We can get them a bit confused as to what relates to what. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about that. Okay. So welcome. My name's Helen. As Jane said, I'm the Learning Development Manager here at Caudwell Children. So we are a charity that support disabled and autistic children and their families. I just wanted to sort of press upon the importance of co-production and working with experts by experience. So in recent years, more and more training has been co-produced and co-presented by experts by experience. So the person or the people who are using the services and are best at knowing what they want, which also includes parents and carers and families as well. So at this point, I just want to say a huge thank you to my fabulous colleagues who've helped me with this, who are experts by experience. All of the information I'm going to share has been co-produced with those people who are neurodivergent and disabled team members. So it shows a real insight into what is truly needed to be inclusive. So what we're going to have a look at today then is the difference between accessibility and inclusivity. We're also going to have a look at some tips around language. I know that can often feel like a bit of a worry for people. Some practical hints and tips, being professionally curious, and ensuring a psychologically safe environment for feedback. So if we have a look at accessibility then, so accessibility is the practical elements. So things like ramps or accessible toilets, things like that. Inclusion is that sense of belonging. So it's about adapting activities and feeling like you're able to be part of something rather than sitting on the outskirts of something. So there's a very big difference between enabling someone to enter a room but they might not be able to take part in the activity that's going on. So we've made the room accessible, but we haven't included them in the activities that are going on. So I'm just going to play you a little video. I'm hoping that the sound works. So if it doesn't, please shout up. Can you all hear that?
No, not here.
No, I can't hear it, Helen, sorry.
Can't hear anything.
When you share the screen, there's a little button, a little tick box which says share audio. When you first go into screen sharing, it might be that you need to come out and just go back in and tick that little tick box at the bottom.
That's not on mine. That's really weird.
It might, if you stop sharing, then maybe try and share again, Helen. And then when the thing comes up saying share my screen, there's right at the bottom, it's not very obvious, right at the bottom, there's like two little tick boxes.
It's under layouts and options, share sound. Right, let's try again. Thank you. I'm old school. I do this in front of people. It's not often I have to do it online. Hold on, here we go.
Going out to eat should be a special occasion. Part of the experience is being welcomed to the restaurant and enjoying the atmosphere as you start your evening. Disabled people often encounter situations where there are barriers to accessibility. Sometimes, venues and services attempt to address this. In this example, although it's possible for everyone to access this restaurant, the experience of the disabled person is very different. It is uncomfortable, both physically and emotionally. The building itself is technically accessible, but the experience and atmosphere are not. Just because it's accessible, it doesn't mean it's inclusive. In other words, just because the disabled person can visit the restaurant, it doesn't mean they would want to if the experience does not make them feel welcome and valued. This example helps us to understand the difference between accessibility and inclusion in simple terms. Accessibility means you can. Inclusion means you want to. The opportunity is there for somebody to do the bare minimum. Inclusion means the individual feels thought about as part of the overall experience. When we're somewhere unfamiliar, we have to rely on different types of communication to navigate this new setting. Communication barriers can make it difficult for people to access and interact with services, leading to frustration, confusion, and isolation. In order for communication to be accessible and inclusive, it should be clear, direct, and easy to understand. It should be available in multiple formats, so that all users have equity of access. Sometimes, this also includes taking the time to assist others as they access information. In the workplace, everybody should have equal access to information. Lack of consideration of potential barriers prevent disabled people from fully taking part. In this scenario, by not looking at the person they are addressing and talking too fast, the people in the meeting are excluding their deaf colleague as he is unable to read his colleague's lips. In this case, this leads to him being excluded from an opportunity. All three scenarios were accessible, but they were not inclusive, leading to frustration and inequality. Being inclusive is about enabling equity of access in order for the opportunity to be equal. What can you do in your workplace to make an experience inclusive and not just accessible?
Okay, so if we have a little look at language then, so language is a tool and it's a really complex tool that is always evolving. So sometimes we might struggle to understand the latest slang, or we have to start using new phrases or expressions. So did anyone prior to 2020 think they described themselves as going for a socially distant walk? But these things sort of crop up and change all the time, don't they? So we use language to build relationships and connect with others. And sometimes people are so worried that they might say something offensive that they just avoid talking about disability instead, or even avoid talking to disabled people. Instead of being a tool to connect, language then becomes a barrier, but it doesn't have to be like that. So inclusive language is about being more mindful of how we talk. So recognizing that language holds power, it can help shift attitudes, it can impact how we think of different groups, it can help us promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it can help make people feel included or excluded. So it's not just about removing specific words from your vocabulary. It applies to more than just disability. So it also applies to marginalised characteristics too. So it's not about rigid rules or political correctness. It's about those flexible principles and respect. So you might think inclusive language is another set of rules to learn, but that's not how we use language. Rules are really rigid and they can feel really intimidating. So instead of focusing on rules, we're going to focus on principles and respect. And this allows us to adapt to individuals and also adapt to different environments too. It helps us to let go of that political correctness, which has become controversial in recent times and sort of quite dismissive of important language. So it still takes commitment and it's still a really sort of purposeful shift, but it's not about blame or trying to restrict people. It's about creating that inclusive environment. So it's about addressing people how they want to be addressed, thinking about how our words can be interpreted, and understanding how our language has been shaped. So guidelines can still be appropriate. So obviously we have to look at the individual person, but if you're sending out sort of emails to parents or to families, or you're creating posters, things like that. So if you're writing for a wider audience, you might want some guidelines in there so that you're staying consistent with your language and how you're using it. When we use inclusive language to talk about people, we want to be using something called the social model of disability. So that looks at using plain English, avoiding acronyms because they can be really, really confusing, and avoiding jargon because although it might be, sort of natural to us to use something that's specific to our role or our activities, it might actually be quite confusing for other people. So I'm just going to play you another video. This is something I saw a while ago, and it really, really stayed with me around sort of disability and inclusivity. So I'm just going to play this for you now.
Imagine a town full of physically impaired people, all wheelchair users. They run everything. There aren't any able-bodied people, so naturally, when they built the town, the community decided it was pointless to have ceilings 10 foot high and doors 7 foot high. So the ceilings were built at 7 foot and the doors at 5 foot. In every way, they designed the place the way they wanted it. One day, a few able-bodied people come to stay. One of the first things they notice is the height of the doors. And the reason they notice is because they keep hitting their heads. They come to stand out by the bruises they carry on their foreheads. Soon doctors, psychiatrists and social workers all become involved. Committees are formed. Many people are worried about what becomes known as the problem of the able-bodied. Throughout the town there is a growth of real concern. Specially toughened helmets are handed out, free to the able-bodied, to be worn at all times. Braces are designed which give support and relief, while keeping the able-bodied wearer bent to normal height. Various groups of compassionate wheelchair users get together and form registered charities. Every quarter they have a collection day. Upturned helmets are left in pubs and shops for people to drop their small change into. There is talk of founding special homes. But then one day, it dawns on the able-bodied that there is nothing actually wrong with them, just that society excludes them.
So a little bit of a sort of tongue-in-cheek look at disability and inclusion and stuff, but I think it sort of hits the nail on the head with regards to the social model. So it's not actually you know, an issue with regards to people with disabilities. It's a social issue, it's a society issue. So I just wanted to mention this book called Winnie the Witch. I don't know if you've heard of it, if you sort of work in children's settings, but it actually is a really good way of explaining that social model of disability to children. So Winnie represents the society, so she's the witch. The house represents the environment. Wilbur, her cat, represents disabled people or people who are different, and the birds represent other people's attitudes. So the story, sort of in a nutshell, is Wilbur, her cat, has black fur and green eyes. So Winnie finds Wilbur a problem because she can't see his black fur because her house is all black. So when he has a nap, she can't see him at all. She can only see his green eyes, so he gets in the way. So that's sort of showing that society treats disabled people as the problem. Winnie makes Wilbur green, so she paints him a different colour so that she can see him in her black house. She doesn't ask if he wants to be green because she thinks she knows best. So again, sort of showing that society tries to change or fix disabled people even when they're not ill or in pain. Wilbur's still a problem to Winnie. She makes a bigger change to Wilbur, and this makes him very unhappy because he just wants to be himself. And the birds laugh at Wilbur. So again, sort of disabled people don't want to be changed to fit into society. They want to be themselves, to be equal and contribute to society. And the wrong change creates those social attitudes that disrespect disabled people. So the right change can make sure everyone is equal and respected. Winnie decides in the end to change her house and paint it lots of different colours and keep Wilbur as he is, and they can both live happily in the colourful house. So these changes in society remove those barriers for everybody. So it's better to change our environment and attitudes rather than try to change people with impairments or differences. So I don't know if it's something that conversations with children around disability, that can be a really nice sort of book to look at, and it explains it really, really well. So I'm just going to talk to you now about neurodiversity. So this is following on from the tips around language. So quite often we get some of these words interchanged and mixed up. So I'm just going to explain what they are. So neurodiversity is the collection of all three cognitive profiles. So that is our brain wirings. So there's neurotypical, so people who think and behave in ways that are more similar to the majority of society. You've got neurodivergent people who think and behave in ways that are different to the majority of people in society. And then you've got neurodegenerative. So that's where your brain structure changes due to a degenerative disease such as Alzheimer's. So you're born either neurotypical or neurodivergent, so with one of those two brain profiles. So neurodiversity is an adjective for a collection of brains. So the same way diversity is an adjective for a collection of people. So you wouldn't say one person is diverse, you would say a group of people are diverse. And it's exactly the same for neurodiversity. It's a collection of different brains. So because humans only have one brain, we can't be neurodiverse, only neurotypical or neurodivergent before something like Alzheimer's makes us neurodegenerative. So octopuses can actually be neurodiverse because they've got more than one brain. Just a little fact in there for you. So when we're talking about a group of people then, so as we've sort of seen before, it's not someone's condition or impairment that disables them, it's the barriers that are created by society. And for this reason, we talk about disabled people and not people with a disability, or autistic people rather than people with autism. It's important to use that identity first. On the picture just on the side of the screen, if you sort of say someone with a disability or someone with autism, sometimes that can make the person feel like it's something that they can pick up and put down. It's not part of them. Whereas saying an autistic person or a disabled person, it puts that identity first. Not everyone identifies with that term, so we also use people with a condition or impairment. So we might use words such as disabled people, people with a condition, people with an impairment, people with a condition or impairment, autistic people, or neurodivergent people. So neurodivergent incorporates things like ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, things like that. But we want to avoid terms like the disabled, people with a disability, people with disabilities, people with autism, and people with a neurodivergency. If we're talking about a person, so a singular person, it's the same principle. So we're going to use a disabled person, person with a condition, person with an impairment, person with a condition or impairment, an autistic person, and a neurodivergent person. And we're going to avoid that sort of with term. So a person with a disability, with disabilities, with autism, or with a neurodivergence, because again, it's sort of that identity that they can pick up and put down their sort of disability or neurodivergence, and that's not the case. Sometimes you might need to refer to a specific condition or circumstance. So here are some general principles that are likely to apply. So we're going to avoid negative terms such as a victim of or suffers from. And for example, a wheelchair user, we might avoid things like confined to a wheelchair or bound to a wheelchair, as it doesn't describe the reality. So many wheelchair users can walk and see their chair as a source of independence. And even someone who uses a wheelchair full time, it can still be an inaccurate expression. If it is that you are talking about a specific group or condition, it can be helpful to check with an organisation focused on that condition regarding their inclusive language and their preferences. So what about non-disabled people then? So as I mentioned earlier on, language does change. So in the video that we saw around the social model of disability, that described able-bodied people, and that's not how we term it anymore. So as a general guideline, we use a non-disabled person or non-disabled people, and we avoid able-bodied and normal. Okay. If we're discussing the world around us, there's just some hints and tips that might be useful. So things like describing an accessible toilet and accessible parking instead of disabled toilet, disabled parking, as the term disabled often sort of focuses on that wheelchair symbol. And there might be people who need to use an accessible toilet or accessible parking that aren't in a wheelchair. Quite often we see signs that say no dogs except guide dogs, which can be confusing if someone's got an assistance dog. And people with an assistance dog can often worry that it means that the businesses aren't aware that there are different types of assistance dogs. So important to use the term assistance. And mobility aid. So it's a general expression that encompasses things like canes or crutches or wheelchairs and scooters. So it's a sort of term in general if you're not sure what it is that person might be using. What's really important to remember though is that these are just general principles, okay? So it's always best to ask the individual for their preferred terminology. These are just sort of guidelines as to what's best to use really. So let's have a look at some practical hints and tips. So consider elements such as space. So I know one of my colleagues, he's got quite a big wheelchair, it's a motorised one, and he struggles in some accessible toilets because although he can sort of get in and get out, he can't turn in them. Same thing with lifts. Even one of our lifts in our building here, which we sort of class as you know, really accessible, he can't get into with his wheelchair. Things like automatic doors. So none of our doors are automatic. So if someone who's in a wheelchair needs to go to the toilet or exit the room, they have to constantly ask, you know, can someone get the door for me? And that obviously can be quite demeaning, can't it? If something is out of order, so accessible toilets, for example, it's really important to try and let the person who might be using it know before the session so that they can make other arrangements. It might be that they end up not coming to that session or they're able to use a pad or something like that. But it's really, really important to let them know so that they can make those arrangements. Is the floor slippy? So could it be dangerous to someone using a mobility aid? One of my colleagues uses a crutch and she really struggles on sort of really slippy floors because it's still not sort of textured enough and for her to stabilise herself on. Are there quiet or private spaces for people who might have diabetes or low sensory environments? So someone with a neurodivergence, if it's quite a, you know, a light and sort of loud activity, it might be that they want to have a space where they can just go and decompress and be able to sort of get themselves back to a rational state. Do you have ear defenders available? I do see lots more places having ear defenders available for children, which is really, really encouraging. Are there hearing loops that people can access? And our company is willing to hire, you know, British Sign Language or Makaton interpreters if something's going on. My previous experience working in a high school, it wasn't that the child was deaf, but her parents were. So we hired British Sign Language interpreters when we had a big awards event so that her parents could come along and be included and be involved with what's going on. Is it that you can adapt any instructions for the day to include pictures or now and next or a plan for the day, or even send it out in advance if possible, include pictures of the venue and staff? So particularly autistic children find safety and predictability. So if you're able to send out pictures or information about what's going on in that day and in an accessible format. So pictures are really, really good for using an accessible format. That can be really, really helpful for people to know what to expect. Can we provide things like chunky pens or pencils for those with grip impairments? Are there tabletops that can be raised or lowered to support wheelchair users? Be mindful of using things like sarcasm and humour, as some children might take that literally. Another colleague of mine, a friend of her daughter's is autistic and she started in a football club, really, really enjoying it. But the coach would say things like, you know, if you don't score 3 goals, you're going to have to do 10 burpees or 50 push-ups or something like that. And it was very much tongue in cheek, you know, winking a nod to the parents, but she would spend the whole of that session wondering, is he joking, is he not joking, and being really sort of on edge and worried about that. So just be mindful of things like that. We also tend to use a lot of idioms, so things like it's raining cats and dogs, which can be quite confusing to some children too. If it is that you have got accessibility or diversity going on in your services, show that on your posters in your communications. A lot of the time, the onus to find out about accessibility and inclusivity is on the person, the disabled person or the neurodivergent person. So if it is that you're able to take that query out of that and they can look at the information and know that something's there for them, that is a really, really huge help for them. Can the temperature be changed? It's something that we don't often think about perhaps, but being able to, even if it's open windows to let some fresh air in, or is it, oh gosh, what's the term? Air condition control, things like that. Sometimes the temperature can have a really adverse effect on people. A person's accessibility aid, so their crutch or wheelchair, is an extension of that person. So please don't touch that without permission. That can be really, really upsetting and offensive for them. Be mindful of activity timings. So some children might struggle with fatigue at certain times in the day. Medications might have to be administered at certain times, or they might have lots of appointments in hospital. Something that we discussed, I recently took part on the National Autism Training Programme. And I don't know if you've heard before, you know, people only have a certain amount of spoons every day. And for example, say you're allocated 5 spoons for the day, but 2 of those spoons are used up by just getting to the activity. You've got to get the kids to school, you've got to get breakfast, you've got to get up and get ready, you've got to get, maybe you have to get public transport. And then doing the activity could take 2 spoons out of you, and by 2 o'clock you've only got 1 spoon left and you've still got so much to do. So just be mindful that some children can experience fatigue and they might need you know, regular rest breaks or periods and things like that. Non-speaking doesn't mean non-understanding. Oftentimes on sort of the back of that, we tend to assume developmental ages if someone is non-speaking, or we tend to speak to the parent or carer rather than the individual, and that can be really, really demeaning. So always speak to the individual, don't assume those developmental ages. It's really, really important. And if someone does have a different way of communicating, so often someone who's non-speaking might use something like Makaton, or they might use what they call a talker, so make like an iPad type thing. If it is that you can use that way of communication back to them, that can be really, really helpful, really, really sort of not exciting, but it's really appreciated. It's really inclusive for that person. And try and adapt activities rather than segregate activities. So if you're doing yoga, maybe you could have some chair yoga. One of the chaps I worked with when he was at school, when the school thought they were being inclusive, so while the other children were going off to play football, he was sort of put in a separate area and played table tennis, but it was sort of on his own. So while they thought they were being inclusive, actually that wasn't. And what they did in the end is they put sort of bumpers on the front of his wheelchair and he was able to take part. Another colleague of mine had OCD, or has OCD, sorry, and she really enjoyed shot put, but really struggled with picking the ball up because it was often very muddy or going on the mud. And so her teacher would measure it for her. Oh, sorry, measure it for her, and then they would clean the ball off for her and bring it back to her so that she could join in with those activities, and that meant a great deal to her. Also being mindful of public transport issues. So quite often wheelchair users in particular have to phone ahead, particularly on trains and things like that, to make sure that there's a ramp there. So that they can access the public transport. But even when they get onto the bus or the train, oftentimes there's not always space for them to sit or to get their wheelchair on there. So they might have to wait for the next bus or the next train. So that can be quite frustrating, to say the least. So if we look at being professionally curious, then a top tip is don't be scared to ask. They would, you know, disabled people would much prefer that you ask them questions rather than avoid it, and they don't then feel included. So take the time to chat to the child and the parents and carers, because although that, you know, 2 children in a class might have the same disability, they might be autistic, however, they will all need very different things. So taking that time before the activity to chat to the child and parents and carers about things that would help them and support them is really, really important. Not assuming that you know what's best. We all do it out of the best interest because we think that we're doing the right thing, but sometimes that can be absolutely the wrong thing. Ask what their preferred terminology is. Don't assume that they can't do something. So my colleagues quite often, they'll be involved in a meeting and someone will be shaking hands, and then they'll get to them and not sort of put their hand out to shake their hand. So always assume that someone can do something until you know otherwise. Again, get parents and carers involved. Quite often they've got the best ideas around adaptability and what works for their child and what would be really helpful. Or did you know about this website? Or you can get this off Amazon, or we can bring this to help. And if another child asks a question, encourage that open communication, but again, ensuring that respect. So talk about what terminology is acceptable and why certain terminology isn't. Okay. But really, really important to open up that dialogue around, you know, the disability and again, looking at things as different, not less. Really, really crucial. And lastly, just ensuring that psychologically safe environment for feedback. So we all slip up. If you do say something that they might find upsetting or inappropriate, apologise. We are all learning. They would much rather you go, oh, sorry, and go back and rephrase it, then you sort of do it and then just completely ignore it. Ensure that you encourage that open line of communication between you and the person and family, and ensuring that confidentiality. So a lot of the feedback that I had is that every situation is not always going to be perfect. You know, we're not always going to have the perfect sort of adaptations and things like that. But ensuring that that person feels listened to, feels heard, and they can feedback in a safe environment is really, really important. So please don't dismiss that, and ensure that everything obviously stays confidential. So I'm just going to leave you on a final thought here. So inclusion isn't just inviting someone to sit at your table, it's believing that they belong there. And I just love that quote. I think that's so, so important. So I'm going to open the floor to any questions. I'm going to pop I'm going to stop sharing. In fact, hold on a second. Stop sharing.